Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today I want to talk about frame saws and bow saws. What are they? What are the different types? How are they used? And where can you get some of the things for it? It's a lot of information to cover, but we're going to try and hit it in one video. Let's dive in. Okay, so frame saws and bow saws, what are the difference? Well, basically all bow saws are a frame saw, but not all frame saws are a bow saw. The difference is a bow saw has a string or a tensioning device in the back. So this is in tension, whereas the middle beam is in compression. A frame saw has a frame that goes around the saw blade, and the saw blade is in tension, and the two beams on the outside are in compression. So in this case, you're pulling the blade tight with a frame on either side of it. And in this case, you're pulling the blade tight by having a frame out here and bending the other side of the beam in. So this is a bow saw. It's also a type of frame saw, but this is a frame saw and not a bow saw. So let's go through some of the different types. This is a Robo style frame saw. This is used for resawing, and sometimes they come in even much longer lengths that can be used for doing your pit sawing or milling your lumber from a log. You would actually have a long one of this. One person would be underneath the log, one person would be on the top of the log, and then the whole thing would be running up and down like this, slicing lumber out of the log. These also come in slightly different varieties where these beams might be closer to the blade, and that's usually for veneer sawing because you don't need a whole lot of distance between the frame and the blade. Because the limiting factor on this is how large of an item you can put through here. Right now, I can only cut something that will fit between these frames. So if I'm going to be cutting a log, I can't cut anything that is larger than the distance between these. In Robo's designs, he has these balls on the end that you would usually hold onto. On mine, I actually followed Tom Fidgen and put on handles here so that it makes it a little bit easier to push. But that's a personal preference. This just feels more like a Western style saw. This one is 32 inches long, which is about the length I would really like for one hand, one person. Much longer than that, it's hard to get that full stroke in. But if you go longer than that, you can have a two-man style. And those become a lot easier because each person is just pulling or just pushing depending upon which way you want to do it. And that makes it a lot easier half the time you're just relaxing. Now this is a common one you're going to come across in a lot of antique stores. This is called a buck saw. It is a type of bow saw because there's a string and tensioning device here on the back. And each time you tension it, you're going to want to tension it as far as you possibly can. And then usually I'll stick a screwdriver in there and get one or two more cranks out of it because more tension on this is a good thing as long as you're not putting too much on it. You don't want to break the beams, but you got to put a lot on there to do that. So usually in this style, I'm going to crank it down to about here, then I'll put a screwdriver in there and do 1 or 1.5 more cranks. This was designed for lumber work, so for slicing logs off. If I want to cut a log to length, this is very good for it. It's an aggressive cut. They're usually a cross-cut tooth pattern, and that's because you're going to be cutting across the log. Makes it fairly easy. Now I like to use this in the shop for doing a lot of the rough cutting. So anytime I want to cut a board to a general rough length, I pull this out. It's very fast, very efficient. You can use it one-handed or you can use it two-handed, and you can slice through a board really, really fast. So anytime you're seeing me breaking down lumber, I'm probably going to pull this out to cut it to length. Another thing to be thinking about whenever working with any frame saw or bow saw is when you're done with it, loosen it up. You don't want to keep the tension on it. You want to keep everything loose when you're not using it. Otherwise, if it stays tight, you're going to be straining the pieces in there, and over time that will cause them to break. So loosen it up. Don't want to make it so loose that things fall apart, but just enough so that everything is a little bit sloppy. This is a Continental Style Joinery saw. When England and America went to a lot of back saws, most of continental Europe kept with bow saws. They're something that's fairly easy to make in comparison to how much it goes into a back saw. And if you use them right, they can be very functional in that you can turn the blade, and when you turn the blade, you can cut down as far as you want. With a back saw, you're limited in your cutting depth to how far you can go down before you hit the back of the blade. These come in all sorts of different styles and types. This one has a rip tooth. It's great for doing large tenons, cutting that cheek down. I'll pull this out occasionally. You saw this when I was working on the bed, making tenons for that. Just like any of the other ones, there's a tensioning device on here. You can crank it down and you keep going until you get a really nice cling. And you can see how this one's not tight because it's more of like a thump. When it's really nice and tight, you'll hear a nice ping. This one is actually from a company that's still in existence in Germany, and I can't pronounce it. It's Überdusch, yeah. But you can still buy these occasionally. Actually, I bought this one at a swap meet, and I've used it a few times. It's a lot of fun. This is a turning saw. It's basically what we think of a bandsaw doing, but in a much smaller format. There's about 12 inches of teeth, so about 14 inches from beam to beam. And this one's actually tightened up by spinning this around until you get a nice quick clean tink. There we go. But the reason it's called a turning saw is because you can turn the saw in the cut. You can rotate these handles and change your angle of attack as you go through the work. And then you come to coping saws or fret saws, where the frame is all one piece, and there really isn't a bow on here because the blade itself is what's being pulled on tension, and the frame is supplying that tension. But most people would kind of throw this into the same category, as the blade itself is under tension, keeping it a lot thinner and a lot smaller. Basically, just a small turning saw. It can do a lot of your detail work. So in using the frame saw, you're going to want to set it on the work, get it in line, and I'm going to eyeball down this blade, set it exactly where I want it, and then with one solid smooth push, I'm just going to go start my cut, and then make sure I'm right in line, keep it right in line, one more smooth cut, and I'm right on the line I want to have. Now we can keep on going down. So you're going to be wanting to use your body to do the pushing, but then your arms can be doing the fine guiding and that final little bit right at the end. Then for guiding and controlling, you have two different ways you can rotate it. Number one, you can twist the blade itself, and this will allow both sides of the track to either veer off this way or veer off that way. Or you can rotate the saw across it, and this will allow you to move on your side, it'll move that way, and on the other side, it'll move that way. So sometimes you're going to have to go back and forth between the two until you guide it exactly. Over time, the micro adjustments you're going to be doing while cutting it will be something that you just naturally do to follow that line. So with a Continental Style Saw, it's going to feel a lot like using a handsaw in that your hand is moving in line with it just the same way you would. You want your hand to be in line with your arm, to be in line with your elbow, all the way up to the shoulder, so you're getting a nice clean force all the way across it. You don't want to be moving your body that much, making sure that you can keep that same smooth motion. That's one of the things that determines the blade length, is that it is the amount that you can move your arm and still get a nice clean cut from end to end. Now with the turning saw, I have it in a push orientation. Some people really like it in the pull orientation. Everyone's a little different. Also, I'm going to be grabbing it up here on the knuckle. I'm not going to be grabbing it back here on the handle. Some people do like to grab it up here, but I actually like to grab it in here with my finger either going forward or wrapped around. And then we can start to town. Now I don't want to really force this. I want to let the saw do the work. Try and use the full length of the saw. Don't force it, don't push it. Just let the saw have the fun. And just like that, it's a turning saw. The nice thing about this is if you get to a spot where the blade might be getting in the way, you can actually then turn the saw in the middle of the cut and keep going in a different direction. So the big question I get a lot is, do I put them in a push or a pull orientation? And the nice thing about most of these is if you want to pull it, you just turn the saw around, or if you want to push it, you just turn the saw around. Most of these can go in both directions. There isn't a front or a back to them, with a few odd exceptions. But that being said, I generally cut most of mine in a push. It's just what I'm comfortable with. I use a lot of Western saws, so pushing is something that my body is used to, and I can do much better with much more control and much more force than I can with pulling. If you're used to a pull saw, a Japanese saw, or things like that, just turn the saw around and there you go. You don't have to worry about making sure the blade is in the correct direction most of the time. Each of these saws you can get in different places. This one is a kit from Tools for Working Wood. Gramercy actually makes the kit for the turning saw. This one I got from Blackburn Toolworks, and I have a couple videos on making this one. I have a whole series on making the turning saw. The buck saws you can usually pick up at most antique stores. If you want to see more about that, I have an entire website devoted to finding hand tools. It's called handtoolfinder.com, and a lot more information on that. I'm trying to find the company that made this, and I'll try and put a link to that down below. But I come across these occasionally at tool meets. They're a lot of fun, but I don't use them quite as much since I have back saws and tenon saws. Now there's a lot more I can get into. I'm just scratching the surfaces, especially if you go over to continental Europe, where these are far more common and used a lot more. You're going to see a lot of other different types that are just harder to find over here. And I don't have as much use for them because I tend to use more English style woodworking. If you do have any comments or questions, let me know down below. I try and answer as many of those as I can. Also, if you have anything particular that you're like, oh, you forgot to say this, please let me know. I'd love to hear that down below. So I think that's about it for today. If you did like the video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Also, if you want to help us out, we're on Patreon, or you can click the join button down below and become a member here on YouTube. I think that's about it for now. And until next time, have a wonderful day. I've been framed! Squared.